In this video, we are diving into the most disturbing trap ever created in the Saw franchise, a psychological nightmare so cruel, so unforgettable, and so morally twisted that it continues to haunt fans years after the credits rolled, not because of what it shows, but because of what it forces the mind to imagine, revealing the true philosophy of Jigsaw, the terrifying logic behind the trap, the irreversible choices involved, and why this single moment permanently changed how audiences understood fear, guilt, punishment, and survival making. It's one of the most unsettling experiences ever put on screen, and a horror that refuses to stay buried even long after the movie ends. The Saw franchise has always been built on discomfort rather than spectacle, a carefully crafted universe where fear is not generated by monsters hiding in the dark, but by choices that feel impossible. And among all the twisted devices, elaborate mechanisms, and morally suffocating scenarios ever created, there exists one trap that stands above the rest as the most disturbing, not because of violence, but because of how deeply it crawls into the viewer's mind and refuses to leave. This trap does not rely on sudden shock or exaggerated brutality. Instead, it slowly tightens around the victim and the audience alike, constructed with a level of psychological cruelty that feels deliberate, intimate, and horrifyingly personal, turning the simple act of watching into an uncomfortable participation where every second stretches longer than it should and every outcome feels wrong. What makes this trap unforgettable is the way it is introduced, not with chaos but with calm. An eerie stillness that settles into the room like a suffocating fog, allowing dread to bloom naturally as the viewer realizes that escape is not about strength or intelligence, but about confronting a truth the human mind instinctively avoids at all costs. The victim is not chosen at random, which is what makes the scenario even more disturbing, because Jigsaw's philosophy is never about chance. It is about judgment, about exposing hypocrisy, guilt, and moral failure. And this trap is designed to force a reckoning that cuts deeper than physical pain ever could, making the idea of survival itself feel like a punishment rather than a reward. As the mechanism begins its slow activation, the atmosphere becomes unbearable, not because something horrific is happening immediately, but because something horrific is inevitable. And the audience is trapped in the same waiting game as the victim, counting seconds, anticipating consequences, and realizing that every moment of hesitation tightens the noose of fate. The true horror emerges when the purpose of the trap becomes clear, revealing that escape is possible, but only through an act that directly contradicts basic human instinct, morality, and self-preservation, forcing the victim into an impossible dilemma where both choices lead to permanent loss, and survival itself comes at a cost so heavy that it may not feel like survival at all. This is where Saw transcends traditional horror and becomes something far more unsettling, because the trap does not threaten the body first, it threatens identity, conscience, and sanity, asking a question that lingers long after the screen fades to black. What would you be willing to sacrifice to stay alive? And would you still recognize yourself afterward? The camera lingers just long enough to allow the imagination to do the damage, avoiding explicit imagery while amplifying tension through sound, pacing, and silence, making every mechanical click echo like a countdown to something irreversible. And this restraint is precisely why the trap remains so effective, because the mind always creates something far worse than anything shown. As the moment of choice arrives, the horror peaks not in action, but in realization, the understanding that no outcome here is fair, merciful, or redemptive, exposing the cruel brilliance of Jigsaw's worldview, where lessons are not meant to heal but to scar, and where survival does not mean freedom, but lifelong psychological imprisonment. What truly haunts fans is not what happens next, but what happens after, because even when the trap ends, the damage does not, leaving behind a survivor who may be breathing but is fundamentally broken, forced to live with the memory of the choice they made or failed to make, turning the trap into a permanent presence that follows them long after the physical danger is gone. This is why the trap remains so deeply unsettling years later, because it cannot be escaped by turning off the screen. It embeds itself into the subconscious, resurfacing during quiet moments, replaying the dilemma again and again, forcing viewers to confront uncomfortable questions about morality, fear, and what survival truly means. The trap also represents the purest form of Jigsaw's twisted philosophy, stripping away spectacle to expose the raw core of his belief system, where pain is not the point, but awareness is, and where suffering is justified as long as it forces reflection, making the audience question whether the true villain is the man who built the trap or the flawed human nature that makes such traps effective. Unlike other moments in the franchise that rely on escalation, this trap stands alone because it does not try to outdo anything. It simply exists as a perfect storm of timing, concept, and execution, proving that the most terrifying horror does not come from excess, but from precision. Even among hardened horror fans, this trap continues to be discussed, analyzed, and debated, not for its imagery but for its implications, because it exposes something deeply uncomfortable about fear itself, revealing that the most terrifying prisons are not made of metal and chains but of choices, regret, and irreversible consequences. In the end, what makes this trap the most disturbing ever is not the mechanism, not the setting, and not even the outcome, but the way it quietly asks the viewer a question they never wanted to answer, and once that question is asked, it can never be unheard. If this story disturbed you, intrigued you, or stayed in your mind longer than you expected, make sure to subscribe, comment, and share this video so the channel can keep exploring the darkest and most haunting stories horror has ever created.